Ernest Hemingway continues to work in a vein of realism, but with a much harder edge than we found in the likes of Chekhov or Henry James. His work embodies the Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren formalist notion that style is content. Those, by the way, were two of the preeminent figures in what came to be known as New Criticism, the belief that you find the meaning of a work in the text itself. Those two innovators of formalism or textual literary criticism came in part to this idea by dint of Hemingway's major influence, and Hemingway's influence has been major. His stripped-down, brutal view of the world informs his style, and he's closest in that sense to Isaac Babel than to any other short fiction writers that we have studied. The Hemingway style and worldview are tied to modernism and to literary figures like Gertrude Stein, who was Hemingway's mentor, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound. Stein especially had a major effect on his prose style, getting him to pare down and cut until his language was as spare and as concrete as possible. Hemingway started out as a war correspondent, writing cablese, using language nominally because of the cost per word. He developed a signature and distinctive style that was stimulus-response, unadorned, minimal adjectival usage, cinematic and objective as opposed to subjective. His style would become associated with a school of art called minimalism, which, to the later chagrin and disapproval of Raymond Carver, a fiction writer we'll study later on, was also a label that was put on Carver, though Carver, as we shall see, was a definite heir to Hemingway as well as to Chekhov. But Hemingway's style, as well as his ethic about living life to the hilt and facing its briefness and brutality with courage, were singularly influential, even to the extent that two other great American short fiction writers and celebrated novelists, William Faulkner, whose style, by the way, is the very antithesis of Hemingway's, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, were overshadowed by Hemingway, particularly in terms of influence on fiction writing in the 20th century. There's a little instructive story of supposed exchange between Hemingway and Fitzgerald that appears in The Snows of Kilimanjaro, where Fitzgerald says, "Ernest, the rich are different than you and me," and Hemingway supposedly answered, "Yeah, they have more money." It's that kind of basic brevity that we associate with Hemingway, but it's also the philosophy and the idea of the Hemingway hero. We're going to meet Nick Adams, who is a prototype in many ways of a Hemingway hero or protagonist that you meet later on in the novels, like Frederick Henry in A Farewell to Arms, even like Jake Barnes in The Sun Also Rises, or Robert Jordan in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Hemingway was often critical of other writers. He spoke admiringly of Babel, however, commenting with approval on Babel's concision and saying that Babel demonstrated stylistically what could be done with prose when the unnecessary or the superfluous is omitted. Though the two writers are alike in sensibility and style, Hemingway's influence is far beyond that of Babel's. Well, he lived longer and he produced novels, and novels were made into movies, and he became a figure of popular culture. But it's not only the oeuvre and the public role that Hemingway played, it's his philosophy and his concerns and the influential ethos that he developed and that view of heroism in a world, as he saw it, devoid of meaning, that he's able to fashion so powerfully in pretty much all of his fiction. In My First Goose, we focus on the narrator, Lyotov, whereas in The Killers, the story we're going to talk about, we have a story that seems to revolve around the experience of Nick Adams, but could as readily be seen as Ole Anderson's story. Before we get to that story, I should mention here that a British critic by the name of Wyndham Lewis called Hemingway's style dumb ox because of its simplicity. Lewis seemed to feel also that Hemingway's emphasis on what was often described as booze, belly, and broads deserved that dumb ox appellation, but Hemingway explained that his style was emblematic of what he called the iceberg effect, where an eighth of the meaning and the content of the language is above the water, while the rest is subtextual, under the surface. Examples in The Killers are in these wonderful lines like, "Nick had never had a towel in his mouth before." We find out that Nick is being tied up by these two menacing figures who come in, and just that line, "Nick had never had a towel in his mouth before," has so much weight to it, has really a kind of poetry to it. Or Ole Anderson, the boxer whom these killers have come to do in, Ole Anderson looked at the wall and did not say anything. These are lines that have almost become parodied because of their simplicity, but underneath them is a subtext, and beneath the lines is meaning that resonates far beyond the lines themselves. Here's the opening of The Killers, one of the most parodied, imitated for better or worse, openings probably in modern short fiction. The door at Henry's lunchroom opened and two men came in. They sat down at the counter. "What's yours?" George asked them. "I don't know," one of the men said. "What do you want to eat, Al?" "I don't know," said Al. "I don't know what I want to eat." Outside it was getting dark. The street light came on outside the window. The two men at the counter read the menu. From the other end of the counter, Nick Adams watched them. He had been talking to George when they came in. This almost seems like, one of those primers you read when you're a kid in elementary school, run, skip, run, that sort of thing. I mean, it seems simple, flat, declarative sentences, and yet it sets a tone, it sets a mood, it provides us with a feeling for what will unravel in the story or what will really become revealed in the story underneath the simplicity. And underneath it, initially, we begin to discover very quickly is a kind of menace. These two men come in, sort of like the movie with Ernest and Marty, "What do you want?" "I don't know, what do you want?" But we're getting into a kind of flavor, a tenor, a rhythm that is characteristically and sometimes really exquisitely Hemingway. Hemingway's first collection of short stories and vignettes is a collection called In Our Time, a number of them featuring Nick Adams, in fact. It was published in 1925, 2 years before the publication of The Killers. There's a story in that earlier collection called Soldier's Home, which again illustrates what I'm talking about here. It centers on a returned soldier whose name is Krebs, and it's instructive of Hemingway's style. Krebs comes back and he's a little bit shell-shocked from the war, and all these stories are going around about heroic deeds and things that people did in the war that are confabulated and don't even represent reality. And Krebs becomes more and more dissociated. And there's a scene in which his mother is saying to him, this is in his home in Kansas, his mother's saying to him, "You've got to get out, and you've got to go to church, and you've got to go to the dances, and you've got to meet girls, and you've got to become more active," because clearly he's becoming almost semi-catatonic from the war and the way the war weighs on him. And Hemingway describes Krebs as simply looking at the breakfast his mother has laid out for him, includes bacon, looking at the bacon as it curls, as it changes, as bacon that's been fried, let's say, will do. And just that sentence alone and all of its subtext, all that iceberg underneath it, is classic Hemingway. But it's not only Hemingway's style, it's his stoic philosophy of life, associated with that famous phrase, grace under pressure, and living with the recognition of death's being ever in the forefront of human destiny. It's about as influential in fiction as work like The Wasteland is by T.S. Eliot in poetry. And In Our Time was an experimental and innovative work. It was a fusion of poetic prose, which included sketches and stories. And it was indicative of a trend during this period of individual stories being linked together with the unity that one might associate with a novel. Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio was a major influence, an example of that on Hemingway. And other American writers like Gene Toomer, who wrote Cain, or years later William Faulkner in Go Down Moses, or African-American writer Ernest Gaines in Bloodline, followed this pattern of interlocked stories, producing similar works. And the volumes of interlocked or interconnected short fiction were what Babel put together in Red Cavalry, or what Joyce published with his landmark Dubliners. The Killers, specifically, is out of a kind of hard-boiled or noir American fiction style. Became identifiable with writers like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. And The Killers is one of the many Nick Adams stories that's an initiation story for Nick. We go through various forms of initiation that Nick goes through. In this story, he's on the verge of moving into adulthood, and the story reflects his initiation into manhood, as well as his loss of innocence into the realm of experience, as we've seen before, and we'll see again in so many stories. He meets a couple of hired killers. They enter into a diner, they're dressed in black, and they expect to find this ex-boxer named Old Anderson, who eats there every evening. And after this initial banter, revealing to Nick and the diner manager George why they're there, the killers tie up Nick and the black cook Sam and put them in the kitchen. When Old Anderson fails to show up and they leave, George, the manager, unties Nick and suggests he go and tell Old Anderson. Nick does, as George suggests, but Old Anderson tells Nick he's tired of running and he wants to run no more. Nick goes back to the diner and he tells George he can't bear thinking about Old Anderson waiting in his apartment to be killed by two hitmen. Nick indicates that he'll be getting out of town, and thus the story ends. Well, Nick learns a great deal in this incident about violence and the murderousness and evil that are out there in the world, as well as the corruption and lethal kind of mafia paybacks that were all too commonplace during the rough Prohibition era in Chicago. The story is set nearby Chicago in Summit, Illinois. Hemingway, by the way, was born and grew up in Oak Park. He was born there in 1899, which Oak Park is a suburb of Chicago. He once derogated Oak Park in a much quoted remark as a place of wide lawns and narrow minds. His own exposure to violence came early on when he went with his country doctor father to an Indian camp, an experience turned into a fictional piece in Our Time. And he witnessed a cesarean that was performed by his father without anesthetic on an Indian woman that caused her to scream so much that the husband, who was hearing all this, committed suicide. Hemingway and his father would both later also commit suicide, Hemingway taking his life in 1961 with a shotgun in Ketchum, Idaho. But his personal experience with violence, the experience which shaped his vision, began there and went on and can be seen reflected in stories like the ones in Our Time or in The Killers, just in the sense of the world being such a violent place. Remember that Hemingway was wounded in 1918. He was a volunteer ambulance driver for the Italian Army in World War I. He went out to see action. He went out to experience war, much in the way Babel did. And he saw it. And what he saw became something that he internalized and absorbed as an artist. He learns in The Killers not only of the violence in the world, that is Nick does. Nick's Hemingway's alter ego, his mask, his persona, his voice. But he learns also from Ole Anderson some different kinds of initiation experience. Stoicism, grace under pressure. Unlike Babel's My First Goose, which is a story that clearly belongs to the protagonist, Lyotov, The Killers could just as easily be Ole Anderson's story as it is Nick's, even though we don't meet Ole Anderson until later on in the story. Stoicism, by the way, is the philosophy that goes back to Zeno. We see it in Brutus, who was a Stoic in Julius Caesar. Essentially, it posits the belief in the submission out of necessity to one's fate, without visible emotion, without breaking down, without really showing one's emotions. And grace under pressure is the essence of the Hemingway ethos. I think it was Alfred Kazin who said that Hemingway's mother, whose name was Grace, put pressure under grace because she used to dress Hemingway and his sister like twins when they were younger in very feminine kind of clothes. She wanted the two girls. Getting back to the seriousness of the story, though, it can be seen, the stoicism, in Ole Anderson's reaction to The Killers, Max and Al, and in George's reactions as well, since he's more aware and initiated than Nick and tells Nick in the story's conclusion, you better not think about it. What's he going to do? Nick is asking George. Nothing? George really being kind of a mentor for Nick here. They'll kill him? I guess they will. He must have got mixed up in something in Chicago? I guess so, said Nick. It's a hell of a thing. It's an awful thing, Nick said. They did not say anything. George reached down for a towel and wiped the counter. There again you see that subtext. They did not say anything, he just wiped the counter. There's a lot of seriousness, a lot of stoicism, a lot of real heavy weight here, but you don't necessarily get it in the language. The language is sparse. I wonder what he did, Nick said. Double-cross somebody, that's what they kill them for. I'm going to get out of this town, Nick said. Yes, said George, that's a good thing to do. I can't stand to think about him waiting in the room and knowing he's going to get it. It's too damned awful. Well, said George, you better not think about it. You better not think about it. Well, Hemingway, one of the famous Hemingway critics, Philip Young, wrote about how Hemingway heroes avoid what Hamlet called the pale cast of thought, as Nick does. And as he does not only here, but in the famous concluding story of In Our Time, the Big Two-Hearted River, after he's returned from the war. And in that story, we should mention, Nick makes camp, fishes, stays busy in nature to avoid the psychic wounds of the violence that he has encountered and witnessed. Unlike poor, gloomy Goodman Brown, Nick can do this, though thoughts which carry emotion come rushing in on him uninvited, And he ultimately avoids fishing the swamp because the swamp represents something that he simply can't face. It's that avoidance of thought. At the end of the story, The Killers, Nick wants to leave town, to move on, to forge ahead without having to think of Ole Anderson sitting in the rooming house waiting to be killed. And this is what Philip Young called an instance of thought preventative. So much of Hemingway's philosophy, his ethos, is based on thought preventative. When you're facing death, whether it's in combat, whether you're hunting, whether you're jumping out of an airplane, doing anything that heightens the sense of life because of the precariousness of it, because of the vulnerability you feel, because of the necessity to be in the moment, it stops thought in many instances, particularly when it's violent. I'm now reflecting on what Hemingway conveys to us. And Hemingway heroes often try to prevent thought. And they try to prevent thought through action. You see that through much of his work. Action is a thought preventative. Just doing something like Nick does in the Big Two-Hearted River, just making camp and fishing and so forth, keeps him away from those thoughts, darker thoughts, thoughts about violence. And action does the same thing of all kinds, but particularly in Hemingway we see action which makes one feel the thin cord, kind of gossamer thread, if you will, that separates life and death. And when you feel that cord to a greater extent, or when you feel it more intensely, of course, paradoxically, you feel more alive. I mean, that's what Hemingway's communicating in so much of his work, and that's where Hemingway becomes important to so many writers and becomes such an influence on so many writers. The Killers provide the force in this story behind Nick's initiation, and as I said, you can see the story as a story about Nick's initiation, or you can see the story about Ole Anderson. We don't know what he did, probably double-cross someone. That's a pretty good surmise, but it's his stoicism that comes across in the story that's conveyed. These two men are menacing from early on. They come in, I read the passage, but from that point they become derisive. They use bright boy in addressing both George and Nick. And they do the same in asking George what he's looking at, and then ordering Nick to join George on the other side of the counter. That's Max, the character. Al and Max seem indistinguishable at first, but then they do become distinct from one another. He orders George. And then there's something really also palpably absurd and even comic about these characters, Max and Al. They have derby hats, they have tight black overcoats and gloves and silk mufflers. We're told, in fact, that they look like twins in a vaudeville team. According to Al, his partner Max talks too much. This is what begins to distinguish them. Al says this, by the way, from the kitchen with Sam and Nick tied up and gagged and a sawed-off shotgun nearby. This is one way that Hemingway distinguishes the two from one from the other. Despite their kind of symbiotic relationship, they're different. Like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet, or the hired killers Goldberg and McCann in British Nobel laureate playwright Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, or the two hired killers in Pinter's later play The Dumbwaiter. You can see the kind of influence that spreads out even across the Atlantic of the Killers. When both killers tell George that he's lucky, the implication is that both George and Nick have had their lives spared. They've come close to death. And Al had said after Max calls George that George was a regular little gentleman. He knew I'd blow his head off. The Killers feminize and homoeroticize George and Nick, contributing to an even greater sense of the experience as one impinging on manhood. Bobble, you may recall, evoked homoeroticism in My First Goose, but Hemingway makes it rather explicit. What is of special interest here is the link between male violence and homosexual eroticism, as if both Bobble and Hemingway see and dramatize that link that exists between the two. For example, Max calls Nick George's boyfriend. He tells George he would make some girl a nice wife. Al says George and Nick are tied up, quote, like a couple of girlfriends in the convent. And there's a reference to, by the way, a kosher convent, highlighting the possibility that the Killers are identifiable with a group of mostly Jewish gangsters who were enforcers for the mob and came to be known as Murder Incorporated. And then we have Ole Anderson, heavyweight prizefighter. The Killers have come to murder him. He's powerless against them. The forces that have come to take his life. He just stares at the wall resigned to his fate, unwilling to run from those who were seeking his death, and admitting to Nick that he got in wrong. He tells Nick that there is nothing to be done. You may remember that phrase, nothing to be done. It comes up repeatedly in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And there is a sense in Hemingway of nihilism, of a sense of nothing to be done, particularly for Ole Anderson. He's made his bed, he's going to have to lie in it, he's going to have to stare at the wall. That's his fate. We learned from the landlady that Ole Anderson, the Swede, as he's also called, is a nice, gentle man. We know, nonetheless, as Nick does, that he's doomed, that his past has caught up with him, and that he's going to have to pay the ultimate price. There are other characters in the story who play subaltern roles and seem powerless also against these forces that intrude upon their lives, threaten their lives. Sam the cook, only referred to as the nigger. In other work by Hemingway, such as the Nick Adams story, The Battler, in Our Time, or in the novel A Farewell to Arms, where Frederick Henry inexplicably says Othello was a nigger, there is use of that so-called N-word, indicative of the times, and I think safe to say Hemingway's bigotry. Sometimes there's a difficult line to separate between the two. I think Hemingway, from what we know about him, was clearly bigoted. He was bigoted against blacks and Jews. But nevertheless, you can look at the story and also recognize that the N-word, which kind of captures you and makes you wince, was something that was commonly used for anybody with black skin. So Hemingway's also dramatizing things as they are. Sam is depicted in the story as a black man who wants above all to avoid trouble, and that's why he urges Nick not to go see Ole Anderson. And he evokes that manhood motif again when Nick decides on his own volition to go to see Ole Anderson, and Sam says, little boys always know what they want to do. George runs the eating place, but it's owned by someone named Henry. Mrs. Bell runs the rooming house where Ole Anderson is, but it belongs to someone named Mrs. Hirsch. The reasons behind sort of the masterpiece status of The Killer are many. The brevity and economy of the language, the emotional impact of the story and Nick on us as readers, and also the philosophy that we begin to see, the Hemingway ethos that are conveyed in this story, including not only the notion that inherent violence in life is endemic, pervasive, but the increased sense of life's intensity and polarities of either stoicism or a call to action when death is faced. Ole Anderson, the ex-pugilist, tired of running, is stoic, accepts his death and refuses to act. But Nick, the observer, the younger man, who has attained this knowledge of Ole Anderson's inevitable fate, goes on the run, leaves, gets out of town. The power of this story is really in its embodiment of the archetypical themes of initiation and manhood also. The Killers is in so many ways classic, vintage Hemingway. We see it in all the hallmarks of Hemingway's distinctive and profoundly influential style, which was shaped to a great extent by his experiences with Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound, his mentors, while he was living as an expatriate in Paris, but also have origins in his earlier journalistic work for both the Kansas City Star and the Toronto Star. Hemingway wrote his first literary work at the age of 17 and went on to distinguish himself as one of the leading figures of the 20th century. A lot of this had to do not only with his output, but the fact that he lived a life that was larger than life. Even took on the sobriquet Papa, which we learn all about in a personal memoir about Hemingway called Papa Hemingway by A.E. Hotchner. In 1953, Hemingway was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his novel The Old Man and the Sea, again a novel of stoicism, of courage, of an old man simply sticking with, well, stick-to-itness and showing great resilience. And in 1954, he was named as a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature. His influence on a host of writers has been singular, especially a bevy of significant American writers. F. Scott Fitzgerald, with whom he was friends and they read each other's work, but also John Steinbeck, the African-American writer Richard Wright, Norman Mailer, who compared himself to Hemingway. He talked about Hemingway as the heavyweight champ and said that, there's that boxing metaphor again, that both writers were very drawn to boxing. talked about Hemingway as the heavyweight champion, said he, Mailer, wanted to essentially step into his shoes and get the heavyweight title. Joan Didion, contemporary author of novels like Play It As It Lays, who writes a very sparse, lean prose with a lot of this iceberg effect and subtext. And as we'll see, Raymond Carver, called America's Chekhov. And he was certainly not only influenced by Chekhov, but influenced to a great extent by Hemingway as well. It's difficult really not to see the influence of Hemingway as being global, because although he's an American writer, and although the writers I've mentioned are American writers, nevertheless, Hemingway was celebrated and much admired throughout Western Europe and Eastern Europe. He was admired, in fact, in the Soviet Union, where Babel's life was snuffed out at such an early stage. And he was admired to a great extent in the Soviet Union because he was seen as a writer who championed the proletarian, the ordinary people. By the time he came to write For Whom the Bell Tolls, he was anti-fascist, and this, of course, also endeared him to a great extent to the Soviets. When I compared Hemingway's influence in the modern short story to T.S. Eliot's influence in poetry with The Wasteland, it's because of a story like The Killers. The Killers is not only a story that's taught in universities throughout the world, but it's a story that's imitated. It's a story that, to some extent, we see the influence of in so much popular culture. Hired killers and guys who, like I said, almost seem like they're stock out of vaudeville, and all of the kinds of things that are really new in Hemingway have become a part of American culture and really a part of world culture. It's hard to separate Hemingway from many of the writers who have tried to imitate him, but he was really the first. I mean, we've talked about a lot of parallels to Babel, and they are certainly there. But he was the first to really express this Stoic philosophy in terms of the everyday, in terms of the ordinary. He's the first to really give us this sense of an inordinate menace that seems to be out there. Suddenly, guys are sitting in an establishment, going about their business, and then from out of nowhere, this threat, this menace comes into their lives. Why? Because they happen to be there. They happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they could easily have been killed. They were fortunate, indeed, to get away. That sense of threat, that sense of menace that's simply out there, is something that comes across very strongly in The Killers and in Hemingway's work. And what Hemingway seems to be saying is there are killers that are out there, and they're out there to get you. I don't mean to be mordant about this, but I think it's the power of Hemingway's work. He once said, in fact, that life is like a baseball game, and you know you're going to be thrown out. You just don't know how it's going to happen or why it's going to happen. There's a scene in A Farewell to Arms where Frederick Henry is sitting and there are a bunch of ants on a log. And the ants are crawling along the log, and he's looking at him, and he says to Catherine Barclay, his lover, he says, I could just kick that log over and all those ants would be dead. It's like a microcosm of how Hemingway viewed the world. What does he decide to do instead? He decides to take his coffee and pour it on to the ants so that they steam to death in a much more horrible, brutal death, and says, God is a fascist. A horrible kind of conclusion to make, but that sense of the ubiquitousness of death and the threat and menace of it happening randomly and capriciously is something we see in The Killers and so much of Hemingway's work. And from this great modernist writing and its harsh realism, well, from the harsh realism we find in Babel and Hemingway, we're going to move on to another writer of great distinction who was also a contemporary of theirs and is another of the great modernist short story writers, a European Jewish author who, like Babel, experienced the fall of an empire, yet who is far different than Babel and Hemingway in his sensibility and in the nature of his storytelling. We have words that are common to our lexicon because of the distinctive style of the individual writers, words like Chekhovian and Joycean, and of course, Hemingway-esque. And we go next to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the work of another inimitable, masterful short fiction storyteller who immerses us into a surreal and cockeyed world we have come to associate with a word of now common usage, Kafkaesque. And in the next story by Kafka, we meet a man, an artist, willing to die for the sake of his art. Next up for discussion, Franz Kafka and his great story, A Hunger Artist.